Have you ever sat quietly at the end of a long, exhausting day, looked around at everything you've done, and realized not one single bit of it was for you? Have you ever canceled your own plans, pushed your rest aside, skipped your meals, stayed up through the night, and poured every last drop of your energy into someone else's life, only to watch them walk away without so much as a thank you? And the worst part, the absolute worst part, is that when you needed someone, when you were the one struggling, just empty space where all those people used to stand. If that feeling sounds familiar, if that quiet ache in your chest right now is nodding along to every single word, then stay with me. Because this story was made for you, not for someone else. For the person who has been told their whole life that being kind, being available, being selfless is the highest virtue a human being can possess, and who believed it so completely that they forgot to ask one simple, devastating question: what about me? Now, before we go any further, I want you to take a breath. Just one slow, steady breath, because what I'm about to share with you isn't just a story. It's a mirror. And sometimes, looking into a mirror for the first time, really looking, without flinching, can feel uncomfortable. But on the other side of that discomfort is something extraordinary, something most people spend their entire lives searching for without ever finding it. Who had absolutely no idea that the very thing he believed was his greatest strength was slowly, quietly. So let's go back to the beginning. Let's go back to Daniel. Picture this. A small town, the kind of town where everybody knows everybody, where the smell of morning bread drifts through open windows, where children play outside until the streetlights come on, and where your neighbors have known your name since before you could properly say it yourself. About Wente, retired of the noise and the rush and the loneliness that somehow follows you everywhere in a crowd. And in this town, there was a man, rough hands from years of work. Now, Daniel wasn't famous. He wasn't particularly wealthy. He didn't have any extraordinary talent that set him apart from everyone else. But what he did have, what made him Daniel, was his absolute, unconditional, almost supernatural willingness to help without hesitation, without complaint, without so much as a flicker of reluctance crossing his face. If someone needed boxes moved from one end of their house to the other and their back was playing up, they didn't hire someone. If a widow down the street had a leaking pipe, or a broken window, or a garden that had gotten out of hand, she didn't wonder long about who to ask. And in a world full of people who are too busy, too tired, too preoccupied with their own lives to give you 5 minutes of their time, a man who never says no becomes something very precious very quickly. He became, without anyone quite planning it, the town's unofficial problem solver, the human Swiss Army knife, the one person everyone turned to when things went wrong. He genuinely believed in the deepest, most sincere part of himself that being useful was the same thing as being valued, that being available was the same thing as being loved, that every hour he gave to someone else was an hour building a future where people would look back and say, asterisk, there goes a good man, a real one. Asterisk. His mother used to watch him from the kitchen window. She'd see him heading out at odd hours, sometimes before the sun was properly up, sometimes long after it had gone down. Every evening, when Daniel finally came home, he was covered in the evidence of his day, dust from someone else's renovation, with something deeper, something emotional, something that couldn't be fixed with sleep. And every evening, his mother would look at him across the dinner table. This kind, generous, endlessly giving son of hers, and she would say the same thing, gently, carefully, the way you say something important to someone you love when you're not sure they be ready to hear it. Daniel, my darling boy, you help everyone in this town. You fix everyone's problems. You carry everyone's weight. But why does nobody ever do the same for you? And Daniel, every single time, would give her that small, steady smile, the one that didn't quite reach his tired eyes, and he'd say, it's all right, Mom. One day, people will remember. One day, they'll return the favor. His mother never argued, but she also never stopped worrying, because she knew the way mothers always seem to know, even before the evidence is there, that the day Daniel was waiting for was never going to come. Not in the way he imagined. Not unless something changed. and something was about to change. It just wasn't going to happen gently. Now, I want you to pay close attention here, because what happens next is the kind of thing that sounds small on the surface. Just a storm, just a bit of rain. Nothing dramatic, but underneath it carries the weight of an entire lifetime of choices. And maybe, as you listen, you'll recognize this moment. Because most of us have had one. That one specific incident that cracks something open inside you. That moment where the fog lifts, and suddenly you really see what has been happening all along. For Daniel, that moment came on a Thursday evening in late autumn. The sky had been threatening all day. That heavy, bruised sort of gray that settles over a town like a lid on a pot, pressing everything down, making the air feel thick and restless. People in the town could feel it coming. Animals went quiet. The wind picked up and short, sharp gusts that rattled windows and sent dead leaves spinning up into the air like they were trying to escape what was coming. And one by one, the townsfolk began doing what sensible people do when a storm is on the way. They brought their things inside. They secured their garden furniture. They tied down anything that could be caught by the wind. They covered their vegetable patches and moved their tools into sheds and bolted their gates. Daniel saw this happening. He saw the sky darkening, felt the urgency in the air, looked over at his own garden, at his outdoor furniture that was still uncovered, at his plant pots that were still exposed, at his wooden boxers stacked near the wall that would be ruined if the rain hit them hard enough. He knew he needed to get his things sorted. He knew this was his window, his chance to do something for himself for once. And then his phone rang. It was Oliver. A friend, or at least a person Daniel called a friend. Though if you looked at their history with clear eyes, the relationship had always flowed in one direction. Oliver needed Daniel to come over quickly. His tools and equipment were still outside, spread across his yard. And if the storm hit before they were covered and moved, they'd be damaged. Could Daniel come? Could Daniel help? And Daniel good, kind, generous, foolish? Daniel said yes. Of course he did. He pulled on his jacket, grabbed his keys, and walked straight out of his own garden, leaving his own things exposed, his own plants uncovered, his own furniture unprotected, and went to help Oliver. They worked fast, the two of them moving through Oliver's yard like a well-practiced team, covering equipment with heavy cloth sheets, hauling tools into the shed, tying things down, securing corners. Oliver directed. Daniel did most of the heavy lifting, and within an hour everything that mattered to Oliver was safe and dry and protected. And then the storm hit. It came suddenly, the way real storms often do. One moment the wind was gusty and threatening. The next, it was a wall of sound and rain and fury that left no time for anything. The rain came sideways, cold and relentless. The wind screamed through the trees. Puddles formed in seconds and spilled over into rivers of mud running down the roads. Daniel, run. He ran as fast as he could back toward his own home. His jacket soaked through before he'd made it halfway there. Rain stinging his face. Mud splashing up around his boots. He ran knowing, in a sickening way, that he was already too late. That the window had closed. That whatever state his garden was in, he was going to have to live with it now. And he was right. By the time he reached his front gate, the damage was done. His outdoor chairs were tipped over and waterlogged. His wooden boxers had split apart where the rain had got him. His plant pots were overturned. Soil washed out across the path in dark brown smears. The small vegetable patch he'd been privately tending to, something just for himself. One of the very few things in his life that was purely his, was flooded. The seedlings he'd been nursing for weeks now, flat and ruined against the mud. Daniel stood at the edge of it all, rain still pouring down, completely soaked, and he just stood there. He didn't shout. He didn't curse. He just stood very still, looking at the muddy mess that used to be the one corner of his world that belonged to him. And he felt something shift, deep inside, in some quiet, heavy place that doesn't have a name, but every one of us has visited at some point. Not dramatically, not with noise. Just a slow, quiet crack, like ice giving way under a weight it's been carrying for too long. His mother appeared at the front door. She'd been watching. She came out with a dry towel, placed it around his shoulders, and stood beside him in the rain for a moment. And then she said, very softly, in that gentle batonist way that only a mother can manage, "Daniel, today you saved everyone else's things, but not your own." She didn't say it unkindly. She didn't say it to hurt him. She said it the way a person says the truth when the truth is simply undeniable, when the evidence is right there in the mud at your feet, and pretending otherwise would be its own kind of cruelty. Daniel didn't answer. He just stood there with the towel around his wet shoulders, staring at his ruined garden, and felt the full weight of everything he'd been ignoring crash over him like a second storm. That night, Daniel didn't sleep properly. He lay in the dark, listening to the rain gradually ease off, listening to the town settle back into quiet, and he turned things over in his mind the way you do when something has disturbed the foundations of the way you see the world. He thought about Oliver. He thought about the dozens of other people he'd helped over the years. He thought about late nights and early mornings, and missed meals, and canceled plans. He thought about all the times he'd put someone else's emergency before his own ordinary life. All the times CD said yes, before he'd even stopped to ask himself whether he actually had anything left to give. And for the first time, he didn't feel proud of it. He felt irate, not physically tired, though he was that too, but tired in a way that sleep could untouch. Soul tired. The kind of tired that comes from spending years running in a direction you never actually chose. Never stopping long enough to ask yourself whether you're going somewhere you actually want to be. The next morning, he got up before the sun was fully out, pulled on his coat, and walked to the edge of town. Not to help anyone, not because anyone had asked, just to walk, and to think, and to find his way to the one person in the town he trusted to speak honestly to him. Old Mr. Harris. Now, Mr. Harris was the kind of person who becomes rarer the older you get. A retired school teacher who'd spent 40 years watching young people grow and struggle and make mistakes, and learn from them or not learn from them. He lived alone in a small stone cottage right at the edge of the river, surrounded by books and plants, and the particular kind of ordered quiet that only people who genuinely made their peace with solitude managed to achieve. He was in his late 70s, but his mind was sharper than most people's half his age. And crucially, he had the kind of wisdom that doesn't shout. It doesn't lecture. It doesn't make you feel stupid for not having figured things out sooner. It just sits beside you and says what needs to be said, calmly, like it was always there waiting for you to be ready to hear it. Daniel found him sitting on the wooden bench outside his cottage, facing the river, a cup of tea steaming in his hands. He looked up when Daniel approached, took in the dark circles, the tired eyes, the residue of last night's storm still visible in the state of Daniel's clothes, and simply moved along the bench to make room. Daniel sat down. For a while, neither of them said anything. They just watched the river moving steady, continuous, unhurried, and let the silence do some of the work that words couldn't. Then Daniel spoke. "I don't understand it, sir," he said. His voice came out quieter than he expected. "I don't understand what I'm doing wrong. I help everyone. Primera, olwa, y, have. I've given my time, my energy, everything I've got, and not just once or twice, but again and again, for years. And yet," he paused, searched for the right words, "I feel empty. I feel like I've been wrung out, and it's not the work that's worn me down. It's the people. It's the fact that when I needed someone last night, no one came. Not one person, and I don't know what I'm supposed to do with that." Mr. Harris didn't rush. He took a slow sip of his tea, looked at the river, and then he said, "Daniel, look at the water, Daniel Lucade. That river," Mr. Harris said, "gives life to everything around it. The trees on the bank drink from it. The birds bathe in it. The fish live in it. The farms up the valley use it. It flows generously, constantly, without asking anything in return. It has given since before any of us were born, and it will give long after we're gone. And yet," he paused, letting the word land, "it never gives more than it has. It knows its course. It knows its banks. It knows exactly how far it can reach and where its limits are. And because it knows those limits, it can give continuously, generation after generation, without running dry." He turned to look at Daniel. "But now, think about what happens when the rains come to heavy, when more water fills the river than its banks were built to hold, when the river loses its shape, overflows its course, spreads out beyond its own boundaries. What happens then? Daniel was quiet for a moment. Then, it floods. Yes, said Mr. Harris simply. It floods. And when it floods, what does it do? It destroys things. Daniel said it slowly, realizing, even as the words formed, that they weren't just about water. Exactly, said Mr. Harris. The very thing that gives life, when it loses its limits, begins to destroy instead. Not because the river has become bad, not because its nature has changed, but because without boundaries, even the most generous force in nature becomes dangerous. He set his tea down on the bench beside him and looked at Daniel steadily. You are not bad, Daniel. You are one of the kindest souls this town has ever seen. But you have no limits. You run for everyone. Always. No matter what it costs you. And you've been taught to believe that having limits, that saying no, that choosing yourself sometimes makes you selfish, makes you less kind, less good. But I'm gonna tell you something, and I want you to really hear it. He leaned forward slightly. Kindness without limits is not a virtue. It is self-destruction. Slow, quiet, relentless self-destruction. And the worst thing about it is that it often goes unnoticed, even by the person it is happening to, until the damage is already done. Daniel sat with that for a moment. It landed differently than he expected, not harshly, but with a kind of precision that made him feel seen in an uncomfortable, necessary way. Like someone had pressed gently on a bruise you'd forgotten you had and suddenly remembered was there. But then what? He asked. If I start saying no, who am I? That's been my whole identity. Being the person who helps. Being the person who's there. If I stop doing that, who does that leave? Mr. Harris smiled, not unkindly, but with the knowing patience of someone who has heard a version of this question many times and knows exactly where it leads. It leaves you aside. Simply, just you, Daniel. Not Daniel who fixes things. Not Daniel who never says no. Not Daniel who is always available. Just Daniel. A man with his own needs, his own time, his own life that deserves tending to just as much as anyone else's. The question isn't who you become when you stop saying yes to everything. The question is, who have you been all these years while you were so busy saying yes to everyone else that you had nothing left for yourself? The river moved quietly between them. I want to try something, Mr. Harris continued. For the next 7 days. Not forever. Just 7 days. When someone asks you for help, before you answer, I want you to pause. One breath. Just one. And in that breath, ask yourself a simple question. If I say yes to this person right now, what am I saying no to? Am I saying no to my sleep? My peace? My time? Something I need to do for myself? Something I've been putting off for weeks? He picked up his tea again. If the answer to any of those is yes, if helping them means harming yourself, then I want you to say, asterisk, not today. Not never. Not asterisk. I don't care about you. Just not today. Can you try that? Daniel was quiet for a long time. The idea felt almost physically uncomfortable, like being asked to use his non-dominant hand for a week. Awkward, wrong feeling, unnatural. Every part of his social conditioning pushed back against it. What would people think? What would they say? What if they were angry? But he also thought about his ruined garden, his flooding vegetable patch, the wooden boxers split by rain. And he thought about Oliver, warm and dry in his secured shed, probably sleeping soundly with no idea that the man who de-dropped everything to help him had come home to mud and wreckage. I'll try, he said finally. The next morning arrived with one of those clean, sharp autumn skies that come after a big storm. Everything washed and bright, the air carrying a fresh, almost electric quality, like the world had been reset overnight. Daniel woke up early, before his usual routine, and stood at the window looking at his garden. The damage was still there. The flattened plants, the split boxes, the general aftermath of a night he'd rather forget. But something about the morning light made it look survivable, fixable, like it was waiting for him to come and set things right. He made himself a proper breakfast, something he rarely did, normally grabbing whatever was quickest before heading out to deal with somebody else, his crisis, and sat down at the kitchen table to eat it. No rush, no one to hurry for, just himself, a warm cup of tea, and the quiet satisfaction of a morning that, for once, belonged entirely to him. His mother came down and looked at him, sitting at the table at a reasonable hour, unhurried, eating a proper meal, and raised an eyebrow. She didn't say anything, but the corner of her mouth lifted slightly, and she busied herself with the kettle, and the kitchen felt a little warmer than usual. Daniel had just finished washing up when the knock came. He knew who it was before he opened the door. You always do in a small town. It was Oliver, his friend Oliver, who had slept soundly last night, with all his tools safely under cover, courtesy of a man who'd run across town in a gathering storm to protect them. Oliver stood on the doorstep looking slightly sheepish but fundamentally unconcerned. In the way people look when they've developed a habit of asking for things and having those things provided without effort, Don Oliver said. With that familiar, easy familiarity, I need a hand. Got a delivery coming and there's a heavy box I can't manage on my own. Won't take long. You know how it is. And here's the thing. Daniel's first instinct, his automatic, deeply grooved, years in the making first instinct, was to say yes. The word was practically in his mouth before Oliver had finished speaking. Yes, of course. I'll grab my jacket. Give me 2 minutes. But then he remembered. One breath. Just one. And in that breath, asterisk. If I say yes to this, what am I saying no to? He looked past Oliver's shoulder. Out in his garden, the broken fence panel that had been hanging loose for months, the one he'd been meaning to fix for so long, it had become almost invisible to him, just part of the backdrop of his life, was swaying slightly in the morning breeze. The one he kept putting off because something else always came up, because someone always needed something, because there was always a reason to go and help someone else before he helped himself. He looked back at Oliver, and he said something he had never said before. Not once in recent memory. Not to Oliver. Not to anyone. Oliver. I'm sorry, mate. I can't. Today. I've got things I need to sort out here. My fence has needed fixing for months and I can't keep putting it off. I can maybe help you later in the week, but not today. The silence that followed was short, but significant. Oliver stared at him, not with anger exactly. More with the genuine, slightly baffled expression of a person who has encountered something entirely outside their expectations. Like a machine that's always responded a certain way, suddenly doing something different. You're saying no, he said. Almost like a question. Almost like he wasn't sure he'd heard right. Not no forever, Daniel said, keeping his voice steady, friendly even. Just not today. Oliver left. He wasn't rude about it, but he wasn't warm either. There was a particular quality to his silence as he turned and walked away, a slight stiffness in his shoulders, the body language of a man who is used to getting what he wants and is processing without much grace. The first time he hasn't. Daniel closed the door, stood in his hallway, and felt the guilt arrive exactly as he'd known it would, a familiar, warm, slightly nauseating wave of it, making him second-guess himself almost immediately. Asterisk. He probably needed you. He'll be annoyed. He might tell people. He might think you've changed. They all might think you've changed. Asterisk. And then another voice. Quieter, newer, but somehow steadier. Asterisk. You have changed. That's the whole point. Asterisk. He went out to his garden, picked up his tools, and spent the morning finally fixing the fence that had needed fixing for months. And something happened that he hadn't anticipated. Something small but real. As the fence went up, one panel at a time, solid and straight and properly secured, he felt something shift in his chest, a kind of satisfaction he hadn't felt in a very long time. The specific satisfaction of doing something for yourself, of finishing a task that had your own name on it, of looking at something and knowing, asterisk, I did that for me, because I needed it. Asterisk. It sounds simple, but for a man who had spent years feeling invisible in his own life, who had slowly, without noticing, stopped belonging to himself, it was enormous. The days that followed were an education, not a comfortable one. Change rarely is, but a real one. The kind that gets under your skin and rewires something fundamental about the way you move through the world. On the second day, a neighbor came by asking Daniel to help carry her shopping bags from the car. Something Eddie'd done dozens of times without thinking. Something that had become so routine she barely even asked with much ceremony. More just assumed and informed. And Daniel, politely but clearly, said he was in the middle of something and couldn't stop right now. She looked surprised, not offended. Exactly, just surprised. In the way you'd be surprised if a vending machine that always dispensed the same snack suddenly offered you something different. She managed her bags herself, and the world did not end. That afternoon, another neighbor asked if Daniel could have a quick look at a wobbly chair leg, something that would have taken him 20 minutes and cost him nothing he needed right now. But that still fell under the new principle he was testing. He looked at what he was doing, finally clearing the debris from the storm, sorting his garden out properly, doing the slow and unglamorous work of reclaiming his own space. And he said, simply, "Not today, I'm afraid." It tied up. 2 small refusals. Both of them felt massive in the moment. Both of them turned out to be entirely survivable. That evening, for the first time in longer than he could properly remember, Daniel sat on his back steps, his own steps, looking at his own garden, and felt something he hadn't expected. Not guilt, not anxiety, not the low-level hum of someone's unmet need pressing on his conscience. Just quiet, justa simple uncomplicated, almost foreign sense of peace. It was so unfamiliar that it took him a while to identify it. He just sat with it, cautiously, like you'd sit with a stray animal you weren't sure about yet, not wanting to startle it away. Asterisk, is this what other people feel like every evening? He thought. Asterisk, is this what it is like to finish the day without feeling like you've been emptied out? On the 4th day, the weather turned again. Not another full storm. Nothing as dramatic as what had already passed, but a steady, persistent gray rain that settled over the town and leaked quietly through the gap in Daniel's roof that he'd noticed weeks ago and never had the time to deal with. He looked up at the wet patch, spreading across the ceiling, and did what Eddie always done in the past, except now for himself instead of for someone else. He waited. He looked at the door. He thought, almost instinctively, asterisk, surely someone will come. Surely one of the dozens of people he'd helped over the years, fixed their fences, carried their boxers, saved their tools from the rain would notice. Would knock, would say, "Hey Daniel, I heard your roof's giving you trouble. Let me give you a hand." No one came. He stood there in his kitchen, listening to the rain drip into a pot he'd placed on the floor, and waited. And waited. And no one came. Not because they were busy. Not because they didn't know, but because, and this was the honest, painful, unavoidable truth of it, people had never thought of Daniel that way. They'd never had to. Daniel had always been the one who showed up, so nobody had ever developed the habit of showing up for him. He could have been furious. He had every right to be, but somewhere between that realization and the anger he was entitled to feel, something else arrived instead. Something unexpected and oddly powerful. Resolve. He went to his shed, found his tools, came back in, and spent the next 3 hours fixing his own roof. It was hard. It was awkward. Working at angles he wasn't used to, in a small space, with a steady drip of cold water making everything damp and slippery. It took longer than it would have with help. He made mistakes he had to unpick and redo. His back ached, and his knuckles were scraped, and there was a moment, about halfway through, where he sat back on his heels and genuinely questioned whether he was making things worse. But he kept going, and when he finally sealed the last edge, came back downstairs, moved the pot, and looked up at the ceiling, dry now, properly sealed, sorted, he felt something that was almost too large to name. It wasn't just pride. It was something older and deeper than pride. It was the feeling of knowing in your bones, in the quiet, private place where you actually live, that you are capable, that you don't need to wait, that you can take care of yourself, and that doing so is not a failure of character but a fundamental act of... He stood in his kitchen alone, rain drumming steadily on the roof above him, his roof sealed in sound, and whispered to himself, "So this is what it feels like." Now, I need to pause here for a moment, because this is the part of the story where a lot of people who are built like Daniel, people who spent years in the same pattern, start to feel a kind of internal resistance, a voice that says, asterisk, but if everyone did this, if everyone put themselves first, wouldn't the world become cold? Wouldn't people stop caring for each other? And it's a fair question. Genuinely, it deserves an honest answer. Hear us the truth. There is a profound difference between being a giving person and being a person who gives without limits. The first is beautiful. It's what makes communities work, what makes friendships last, what makes families strong. The world absolutely needs people who give, people who show up, who share, who care. But the sick in giving without limits, giving to the point of self-erasure, saying yes until there's no you left. That isn't generosity. It only looks like generosity from the outside. From the inside, it's something else entirely. It's fear. Fear of being disliked. Fear of being seen as selfish. Fear of what happens to your identity, to the way people see you, to the way you see yourself, if you stop being endlessly available. And here's what's crucial, what Mr. Harris understood and what Daniel was slowly, painfully learning. You cannot genuinely give to others from a place of emptiness. You cannot be truly generous when you're running on fumes. When you give and give and give without replenishing yourself, starts being resentment, dressed up in helpful clothing. Real he. Enero City. The sustainable kind. The kind that actually helps people in the long run can only come from a person who has enough, who has taken care of themselves, who has protected their own resources, their own energy, their own peace, and from that solid, well-rested, genuinely willing place, chooses to extend themselves to others. Daniel hadn't been doing that. He'd been doing the opposite. He'd been running himself into the ground in the name of kindness. And the result wasn't a town full of people who loved and appreciated him. It was a town full of people who had learned to take him for granted, who'd stopped seeing him as a person and started seeing him as a resource, an asset. A tool that was always there when you needed it. And you can't love a tool. You can use it. You can be grateful when it's around, but you can't really love it. Because loving something requires seeing it as real as having its own needs, its own limits, its own value beyond what it can do for you. By always saying yes, Daniel had inadvertently made himself invisible as a person. He'd made himself only visible as a function. And now, one day at a time, one quiet refusal at a time, he was making himself real again. Weeks passed, and what happened, what gradually, almost imperceptibly began to shift around Daniel, was not what he'd feared. He'd braced himself for resentment, for people to turn cold, to stop inviting him places, to gossip about how he'd changed. He'd expected the town to punish him for the crime of finally choosing himself. But that's not what happened. What happened instead was subtle, and in some ways, more profound. People started managing. They started solving their own small problems instead of defaulting immediately to Daniel. Oliver, specifically, Oliver, who'd always knocked on Daniel's door before he'd even tried anything himself, started figuring things out. He borrowed a neighbor's trolley for the heavy box, enlisted his teenage son he'd never thought to ask before, found that his own problem-solving muscle, long atrophied from disuse, still worked perfectly well when it needed to. The neighbors who'd relied on Daniel for small tasks found other solutions, not because they didn't like him, but because they had no choice. And in having no choice, they rediscovered their own capability, their own resourcefulness, the satisfaction of sorting something yourself that you'd previously outsourced. And here, Estepar, nobody warns you about. When Yuri, in the middle of learning this lesson, they started respecting Daniel more. Not despite his boundaries, because of them. There is something about a person who knows their own worth, who treats their time as valuable, who says calmly and without apology, not today. There is something about that person that commands a kind of respect that availability never can. Availability is taken for granted. Limits are respected. Scarcity is valued, not in a manipulative way, not as a strategy, not as a chem, but in a deeply human way. We instinctively value what we can't always have. We pay attention to what isn't always offered. We begin to notice a person who has previously been invisible because they were always there. Daniel's garden began to look remarkable. The plants he'd been tending now, the fence he'd repaired stood straight and solid. The roof was sealed. The windows were fixed. The house, which had been slowly gathering the evidence of years of neglect in favor of everyone else, began to look cared for. Began to look like someone lived there who valued it. And Daniel himself, his face, his posture, the quality of his eyes, began to change. The permanent gray tiredness that had lived behind his expression for so long, people had stopped noticing it started to lift. Real laughter. The kind that comes from actually enjoying your life, rather than from the slightly manic energy of someone, keeping all the plates spinning. He cooked proper meals. He read books he'd been meaning to read for years. He started on a small project. He'd always wanted to do something personal, which was, of course, precisely the point. He was, for the first time in years, living his own life. And it turned out his own life, when he actually showed up to it, was rather good. He came through the gate and stood for a moment, looking around the garden. The healthy plants, the repaired fence, the neat, well-kept yard, with its quiet evidence of consistent care. And then he looked at Daniel, sitting on the front steps, a cup of tea in one hand, a relaxed and genuine smile on his face that looked nothing like the small, tired, slightly defensive smile he'd worn for years. Mr. Harris sat down beside him, looked at the garden again, thought about Oliver, managing fine, thought about the town, carrying on as it always had, entirely untroubled by the fact that Daniel was no longer volunteering himself as its first and only solution to every problem. He shook his head. "No," he said, and then, almost surprised by the truth of it, "In fact, my world started coming together, the way a teacher nods when a student finally, really gets something. Not to take credit, just to recognize it. To mark the moment, and that is not a small thing. Daniel, that is precisely when the life begins to change." They sat together for a while after that, drinking their tea, looking at the garden, the river, not far away, moving steadily within its banks, giving, sustaining, flowing, but always within its limits, always knowing its course. "Now, I'm going to speak directly to you. You're the one who always picks up the phone, even when you're exhausted. You're the one who shows up, every time, without fail, no matter what it costs you. You're the one who says yes when your body is screaming no, who cancels your own plans to deal with someone else's drama, who lies awake at night, worrying about people who aren't lying awake worrying about you. And somewhere along the way, you started believing that this is what makes you good. But here's what I need you to hear. Really, hear, not just skim past. Saying no does not make you selfish. It never did. Saying no means that you know your own value, that you understand your energy is finite, your time is real, your peace is not a luxury but a necessity. Saying no means that you have finally stopped, given from an empty place, and started building something in yourself worth giving from. Saying no at the right moment to the right person is not a failure of kindness. It is an act of profound honesty to yourself and to them and to Yarny. The beautiful, painful, liberating irony is that when you start saying no, when you start protecting yourself, when you start treating your own life with the same urgency and care you've always given to everyone else's, people start seeing you differently. They start respecting you. They start valuing the times you do say yes. Because yes now means something. Because it comes from a full place, a willing place, a genuine place. Instead of from habit or guilt or fear of what happens if you don't. Your time is real. Your mind matters. Your heart has limits, and those limits are not flaws. They are the thing that keeps the river within its banks. The thing that keeps the giving sustainable. The thing that means you can still be generous 10 years from now. 20 years from now without having destroyed yourself getting there. So let me ask you honestly, and I really want you to sit with this. What is the thing you've been putting off? The fence that needs fixing. The roof that's been leaking. The garden that used to make you happy and has gone to seed while you were busy tending to everyone else's. What is the small, personal, quiet thing that belongs to you and nobody else, that keeps getting pushed to the bottom of the list? Whatever it is, this is your sign. Put it at the top, not because other people don't matter. They do. But because you matter too, and you've known that. Somewhere underneath all the noise and the busyness and the endless helping for a very long time. You've just been waiting for permission to act on it. Consider this your permission. Now, if this story has stirred something in you, if something in the way Daniel's journey feels a little too close to home, if you've recognized yourself in the man who always shows up for everyone but can't remember the last time he showed up for himself, then I want you to do one thing. Just one dot. Before this day's over, say no to something. Not dramatically. Not unkindly. Not with a speech or an explanation. Just quietly, calmly, with the same warmth you've always offered. Say not today. To the request that's been feeling like too much. To the ask that would cost you something you can't afford to lose right now. To the habit that's been slowly, invisibly, steadily emptying you out. Say no, and then use that time, that energy, that freed up piece of yourself for you. Fix your fence, water your garden, repair your roof. Sit on your own front step with a cup of tea and look at your own life and ask yourself genuinely, with curiosity and without judgment. What does my world look like right now? And what would it look like if I started treating it with the same care and urgency I've always given everyone else's? The answer to that question is not frightening. It is the beginning of something. And if this story has meant something to you, if you've heard yourself in Daniel, if something shifted while you were listening, then share it. Because somewhere out there is someone else sitting at the end of a long, exhausting day, covered in the evidence of helping everyone except themselves, wondering why they feel so empty. This story is for them to dot the river knows its banks. Now, it's time for you to know yours. Your time is coming. Keep believing. Keep fighting. Don't just watch. Go out and prove them wrong. Thank you for being part of the journey. If you liked it, please like, comment, and subscribe. Bye.